Chapter 24 Morbright Mine. The wind grew biting as they climbed the rest of the day. They did not stop to eat and only stopped occasionally to drink and rest the horses. At times Haille stumbled, but Sade helped him to his feet, encouraging him, promising him revenge. "You just must endure," he whispered as he picked Haille up again. The clouds remained low in the sky, obscuring the mountain tops and the sun. A little after noon, Silas stopped to water his horse from a stream and to help himself to some of the smoked beef from Haille's rucksack. Silas ate the cheese as well, but tossed a fistful of bread from the loaf baked by Sorrel to Haille and Sade. The piece tumbled through the dirt, but Haille still picked it up. He offered a piece to Sade, but his fellow prisoner shook his head. "You need it more than I." His accent was a strange one that Haille had never heard before. "Where are you from?" Haille asked, checking to make sure Silas was out of earshot. "What do they want with you?" "I am from Great Port. It is an island city to the southwest of Carson's. It is a long story of how I came to be here, but what they want from me is my power." "Power?" Sade lifted his hands. "Bound, I am unable to conjure, but freed, I am a sorcerer." Haille stopped chewing. "Truly?" "Yes. In your kingdom such things are forbidden, but it does not mean they do not exist. The realm of Ansor is a backward place. Those with the gifts of magic avoid it, for your inquisitors are not friends of ours. Where I am from, the men and women with the gift ply their trade like any other tradesman. They work the weather on their ships, mix healing potions, and some can even weave elaborate illusions." "Can you free us?" "Alas, I cannot," Sade said. "I am but a humble sorcerer. I am no archmage. I can work the weather, but I know no spells of power that give life or destroy it. Those are arts long lost, practiced by only the most wise of magi, of which only a small handful exist." "But why are you here?" Haille said, taking a bite of the bread. "The door to the font is enchanted. One needs a charm to open it, so they will need me." "What will they do with us?" "As long as they have need for us, they will keep us alive. They need me for the door, and need you for the wish," Sade said, adjusting his chains. "In the font?" "Yes, but these are dangerous, greedy men. Who knows what they will force you to wish for?" "I'll wish for them all to die, and for us to be released," he said, twisting his wrists inside his manacles. "From a grace that is a healer, I think not. Jasmeen is a different kind of spirit than that. From what I know, she builds on a kernel of strength and power that must already be present. She is no killer," Sade said, looking up into the mountain peaks as if he saw Jasmeen waiting for them there. "Then what do they hope to force me to wish for?" "Power. Power for them so that they are unstoppable. If you don't, your friends are dead." Silas returned and they both went quiet. After checking their bindings, he started off again, his horse wheezing and grunting in the thinning air. The vegetation grew more sparse and soon the path was one of rocks with only the occasional laurel bush or bayberry tree defying the wind and the cold. The road hugged close to one of the main ridges running up into the mountain's heart. The ground dropped away on either side, leaving them exposed to the wind racing across the defile. Haille could see their numbers stretching out over a distance. He could make out the elk by the way its lowered head caught the light in its antlers, and he believed he could recognize Val and Cody, one of them still carrying Caitlin, but he could not be sure. What he was certain of was that the riders were well provisioned. For every mounted horse there were 2 donkeys laden with tools for digging. The line of men and animals stretched for a great distance over the rising and falling ridge. They camped in a ravine where they were protected from the worst of the wind. As on the march, they kept Haille and Sade separate from the other prisoners. Their treatment was not equal. Haille and Sade were allowed to sit next to one of the fires and were even given pieces of smoked meat to eat. They were hardly filling portions, but it was more than was offered to Val, Cody, and Caitlin. Haille asked if some of the bread he was offered could be shared with the other prisoners. The men burst out laughing. "A noble sentiment lost on those brutes," Sade said. "Look out for yourself while you can and eat the bread. A wise warrior has patience and saves his strength for the well-timed attack." The mine was a wound that marred the mountainside. When they crested the last ridge and it came into view just below the snow line, there was no mistaking it. The entrance was a yawning black mouth. the slope below it covered in a vomit of tailings that spread hundreds of feet down the slope to the bottom of the ravine where the waste stone bled off into a river, turning at the color of rust and blood. Vondales and his men unpacked torches, lanterns, shovels, and pickaxes and set up a base camp of sorts just inside the entrance. Haille would have been happy to be left outside, but Vondales wanted all the prisoners inside where they could be kept close. Even the elk was dragged into the darkness of the mine's chambers. Once Haille's eyes adjusted, he realized there was room enough for them and more, for the first chamber was a hollow space that ran in all directions. So much stone had been cut away that only timbers placed throughout the chamber kept the ceiling from caving in. The beams themselves were old, withered and cracking. Some had split and shattered completely. The ceiling about them collapsed in a pile of rubble as the mountain took back the space that was its own. The men tied the prisoners to timbers, each facing away from one another. Amid a pile of abandoned equipment, the men found a cauldron which they scrubbed out and set over a fire. Everyone ate well that night, Vondales allowing all the prisoners to eat, but not to talk. "You'll need your strength tomorrow," he said to them. After a night of fitful sleeping, Haille woke to the sound of Silas and another one of the men standing up a few steps away from him, relieving themselves. "I swear, Lorig, I heard footsteps in the night," Silas was saying. "Just the timbers settling. We would have seen anyone coming in the entrance." "The place is huge. There could be other entrances," Silas said. "So there is some crazy old tramp who lives up here. What do we do, turn back?" "He could be a prospector, looking for leftover gems. He might not want to share." "Then we kill him." Both men laughed, finished their business, and walked away. Haille crinkled his nose at the smell left over, but soon forgot it. He had other things to consider. For instance, if indeed they were not alone in the mines, who was it that was there with them? Could they help Haille and his friends? If there were others in the mine, they did not show themselves that morning. All but 2 of the men followed Vondales into the murk of the mine, the others remaining behind to guard them. There was little to do but sit. When the guards were not looking, Haille worked at his bindings, rubbing them against one another until his wrists pained him, but the knots held fast. Haille was turned so that he could not see his friends, but he could see Sade tied to his timber, dozing peacefully, at least until Silas returned from the depths of the tunnels and woke him. "Come on, magician! Time to earn your keep," he said. "You found something?" "Sure thing. Vondales is quite happy." All the men came along this time, dragging the prisoners, the donkeys and the elk with them. Haille thought it impractical until he realized that the mine had more secrets to reveal. Beyond the first chamber with its creaking timbers and collapsing ceiling was a natural cavern with teeth of stalagmites and stalactites lining the floor and archways. A river of white water cascaded through the center of the cavern before disappearing again under the mountain. Throughout the room still stood a marvel of engineering. Conveyor belts, driven by a water wheel, ran the length of the cavern. Heaps of raw stone waited in piles alongside. The apparatus still worked, and 2 of Vondale's men started to pile rocks onto the belts where they were fed in between 2 massive rollers that crushed them. A series of grates sifted through the debris on the other side where a 3rd man looked for gemstones. The wheels and gears, long without oil, groaned and squealed, but the boulders still moved down the belts, lodged between the rollers and shattered with loud pops. The group continued through a mixture of natural caverns and man-made shafts. The air was stale and smoky from the lanterns. In some of the larger caverns they passed through, the burning lights barely illuminated the darkness overhead and the ceiling was lost in gloom. The shafts bottomed out, then pitched upward. Haille was heartened to see natural light filtering through the air ahead of them. Sure enough, the mine shaft opened into a narrow ravine with sheer walls on either side. It was nothing more than a gap between cliffs, narrow enough that a man could touch both sides with outstretched arms. The floor was nothing but rubble, rockfall from centuries that shifted and clacked underfoot. The mules and even the elk struggled on the shifting ground. The mercenaries and their prisoners passed other shafts that opened into the ravine, cold cavern air wafting out like the breath of the mountain. After rounding a narrow bend in the ravine, the weary crew came to an ornate doorway that was clearly carved with more skill than the miners who had infested the mountain like weevils possessed. On either side were stylized figures of women, their features elongated so that they stretched as high as the top of the opening. They were fierce and foreboding, their eyes narrow and disapproving. The door panels themselves were carved with depictions of flowing water and figures dancing in the waves, figures that were too diminutive to be adults. These were children, and as Haille neared the doors he could make out slings, crutches, and stretchers depicted on the shores of the healing waters, discarded by the children who had been healed upon submerging. Vandales and his men had formed a semicircle around the doors. The men parted as Sade came forward. "Come, Haille," he said, motioning to him with his bound hands. Haille chanced a glance at his friends. Cody and Caitlin were focused on the doors, but Val met his eyes and shook his head, as if to say, "No." But what choice did he have? He thought, looking at Caitlin's mangled hand. Vandale sliced the ropes on Sade's hands with the outsized knives fastened to his gauntlets. "Do your craft, magician," he said. Something about their exchange struck Haille as strange. But before he could consider it further, Sade shook his hands free of the ropes, stretched his arms in front of him, and rubbed his palms on the face of the doors. He closed his eyes, then commenced to whisper. Whether it was a song, a rhyme, or incantation, Haille was not sure. An inquisitor would surely object, but they were far from their narrow-minded jurisdiction. Certain sounds repeated themselves, but the language was incomprehensible to Haille. The others waited in silent stillness, all except for Silas, who was at the rear and spun back to scan the tunnels behind them. He rested his hand on the pommel of his sword, his fingers flexing. Haille focused again on the doors, his muscles tensed. The panels opened with a crack, followed by a heavy grinding noise as they slid to either side, propelled by invisible machinery or invisible forces. Haille knew not which. Vandales called for a lantern while Sade shielded his eyes and peered into the darkness. Smooth, polished columns lined a corridor, and from somewhere beyond came the sound of rushing water. Sade turned to Haille, extended his hand and opened his mouth. But it was not his voice that suddenly echoed in the chasm. "Halt!" Haille turned around. Standing at the edge of the mine shaft Silas had been peering up into, an arrow knocked back in her bow, the string drawn back so that it just touched her cheek below her eye, was Avenger Red. Silas cursed. It was then followed by the sound of drawing steel, even though the blades would be useless while Red held the high ground and kept her aim trained on them. Vandale's nostrils flared and his neck swelled. "Take me," Red said from the ledge. "The font is for those crippled from birth. What could you want with it?" Sade said, shaking his hands toward the open doors. "He knows my affliction," Red said, nodding at Haille. "Affliction?" Sade said. Haille's mind froze. How to explain Red's elaborate deception in few words? But in the end there was not time, for boulders rolled down the pathway of the ravine, and men dressed in the red and black colors of the House of Redmont appeared, heavily armed. At their fore, a long sword trembling in his hands, stood Gaust Redmont. "Father, what are you doing here?" Red cried out, her brow furrowed. "Shut your mouth, Gale. You've caused enough trouble already. These men took slaves that belonged to me, and they will learn not to cross the Redmont clan." "But Lord Redmont," Vandale stepped forward, pointing upwards to Red with his sword. "Your daughter made a deal with us." "She is no daughter of mine. She has betrayed me." "And it seems us as well," Vandale said. "Let us sheathe our swords and discuss this as honorable men." "Why should I parley when I have you outnumbered? Gale, get down here. We are leaving with what is ours. Nobody takes my property from me." What was going through Red's mind, Haille could not have guessed. Ire at her father, the unraveling of her own plans, her desperation to be healed, all must have warred within her. Every set of eyes was turned to her, for their fates waited on her next move. Perhaps she knew exactly what she was doing, or perhaps she was just reacting recklessly. Whatever the case, she sprung her fingers and released the arrow at Vandale's. He was quicker than Haille could have imagined, for Vandale stepped aside and swung his armed forearm in a circle, deflecting the shaft. The arrow shot past Haille. He heard a fleshy thunk and a cough, but thought little of it because he was focused on Gaust and his men charging down the ravine and clashing with Silas, who slew the first 2 men upon him. Then Haille saw the elk, unguarded in the chaos, gallop to Val and Cody, who lifted their hands up and sliced their ropes on its antlers. Cody set to unlatching the muzzle while Val, his face blanched, looked past Haille to a figure laying on the ground beside the open door. "Caitlin," he said, ripping off his gag. Haille had not taken notice of where the stray arrow had gone. No one had until that moment. Caitlin had fallen, the shaft sticking out of her neck, a mess of blood pouring forth over her collar. Val's hands worked at the knots of her gag, loosened it, and pressed it against the wound. Her mouth uncovered, Caitlin coughed up a spray of blood. Her face was pale and her eyes pleading. Cody and the elk came behind Val, and Haille rushed to join them, but he was yanked backwards. He tottered into Sade's arms, who lifted him over the threshold of the doorway. "You can't help her now. No one can." Haille still reached for her, calling her name, horrified at the scene framed in the square of the doorway. Caitlin's prone body, Cody and the elk looking on, the flash and clang of steel beyond, and the twang of Red's bow. Val's blood-stained hands. But with a word, Sade motioned the doors to close. The stone obeyed and the scene was shut away in an aperture that grew smaller and smaller until all the light, all the fighting, was cut off and Haille stood in complete darkness.